So as you can see, I've got our test tiles here that represent what it would look like on white clay, what it would look like on our brown clay. This is just a blend of almost every test tile I've made in the last 8 months. There's some just this is just Temoku, right? There's some that are just single glaze. There's some that are combos. This is purple with SCM over it, and that's what gives me that sort of variated surface up top, right?
What's SCM?
SCM is Strontium Crystal Magic. It's just a little wordy, so Strontium Crystal Magic.
Okay.
Yeah, it's one of the ones over here. It just says SCM on it.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
I use it. I don't know what it was.
And so if you guys ever do use that, that makes everything else super, super runny, right? So you can only use it on the very, very tip, and also never put it on your pot without, it's an overglaze. So you would glaze something, and then you would do a little rim dip after it's fully glazed. It never goes on the pot bed, because it's not designed for that, right? It's basically just a thing to make things really runny and move quite a bit, right? So some tools that I think you guys might need. I'm going to show you a couple different ways to do this, but first and foremost being the easiest way to glaze is just with these glaze tongs, right? So we'll go over that. When I'm going to glaze, what I usually like to do is I'll have a giant bucket full to the brim of water. That way after I'm mixing something, I can take my stick and put it directly in here, and I don't have to worry about it. Reason being, if you just if you're using 5 or 6 glazes, right, and you just leave the sticks in and the buckets off, eventually that water sort of evaporates out, and then the glaze gets too thick, and then runs off your pots, it ruins your pots, it ruins the shelves, right? So that's something we got to be mindful of. So after I'm done mixing something, I just take this, clean it off in here, and then I'll just use the same stick too, so that I'm not having to clean 40 sticks. Yeah, it's just so annoying to do that, right? So you have a giant bucket for that. I've got a smaller bucket for if I need to do any cleanup on pots, right? And then I've also got this here tiny carpet that I've saturated with water. I don't ever use wax when I glaze. I find wax to be more trouble than it's worth. Some people are raised on that, you know what I mean? You gotta wax the bottom of every one of your pots. I don't like doing that, A, because it takes a really long time, because we're not using paraffin wax, we're using Forbes wax, so it takes a long time to dry. B, you have to wipe off the remnants anyways, even after you dip a pot that's been waxed. So this is just so much easier, and I'll go over how this works, right? So those two things, got my carpet, got my tongs. Another thing is a piece of paper, especially if you're doing a series of pots and you're doing a bunch of different combinations to try stuff out. Draw a little picture of what your pot looks like, right? And then put this one was purple with SCM and the inside was this color. Because I guarantee it's going to come out and you're going to go, this is the coolest thing I've ever made. What the hell was it again?
I take a picture and then text that picture to myself at the same time.
I do the same thing, right? Where I take a photo and then I bring that photo up in the photo editor and then I just add text saying what it is so that it makes it easy for myself, right? Easier version of that would be the notebook thing, right? So right here, I've got some Montreat white matte. I'm going to go ahead and get this mixed up. This is a really lovely glaze.
I love that.
It's so nice, especially on the brown clay. It looks super.
Really
you can. One of the things that's really cool about this brown speckly clay, you can glaze much more simply, and it still looks sophisticated, right? There's I really don't love these test tiles that are just oh, it's an off-white clay with one glaze on it. That seems super boring to me, right? But the second you get that manganese and iron in the clay, you can just go brown clay, white glaze, and it looks really good. So I'm just going to spend some time mixing this up. Like most other things we do in the class, overdo it, right? So I mix this for probably a full minute before I start glazing, just to make sure any of the crumbly bits on the side are really sort of incorporated in. Could you get away with 30 seconds? Yeah, but you might as well mix it for a minute so that you know it's right. Correct?
I have a question. How quickly does it settle?
It doesn't. It shouldn't.
So if you've just mixed this, we don't need to mix it again for a little while.
I usually do. I don't think you have to. It depends on the glaze. Some glazes will settle really, really quickly. All of ours are kind of formulated not to do that. They have bentonite in them, and suspenders to keep things sort of floating around a lot. That said, I probably mix every once in a while. You know what I mean? If I'm doing 30 pots.
But if I've seen the Claire's just mix the Key West glue, and then I go and use it after her, I don't need to read it.
If you trust Claire.
If I trust,
I don't know.
I trust her mixing.
Yeah. So now I've been mixing this for a little bit. I'm I'm gonna let this sort of skate
Just for the
off.
record, Tank, I don't do 1 minute mixing.
There you go. I'm gonna throw this in here so that I don't have to worry about it, right? So we're gonna do, let's say my mug first, right? So the very first thing I'm gonna do is this has been in the back, so it's probably covered in dust, right? It's a clay studio. It's sort of inevitable that things get dusty despite our best efforts. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna wring out as much of the water out of the sponge as I can, and I'm just gonna wipe away anywhere I think there might be dust particles.
If you're not gonna glaze right away, can you dunk it, like, and rinse it?
You potentially can, depends on how thin your work is, depends on how much water it absorbs. I don't like to dunk it for that reason. Also, our glazes, you have to kind of formulate them to be thicker.
Yeah.
If you're gonna submerge your whole pot in water because it's gonna absorb less glaze. If you want that, that's great. I know some people will dip the bottom third of their pot on a really runny glaze in water. That way when they dunk it, it doesn't absorb very much glaze down here. So I recommend doing this. It's like the least amount of water you can get away with, you know what I mean? And so that's what I usually like to do. So easiest way, and what I usually do for this like brown clay white glaze, is I'll sort of just pick some parts where I want like finger marks to go. This is like one of the only times I'll do this, is I really like the way this looks. And I'll go in sideways, and then pull out, and let all that glaze sort of drip off my hands. I do this because it'll pool up sort of above where my finger marks are, and so I'll have like a little bit of surface variation there, and then I'll also have some exposed clay, which I really like.
And that exposed clay is food safe.
Yeah, well, you're not putting coffee on, you know what I mean, on the outside of the pot.
Right.
Anyways, really the part you got to be worried about is the inside. So a lot of my personal work, I don't glaze the outside whatsoever. I leave it raw clay and then I sand it to a high grit.
Okay.
And that's how I can get away with that. It's like the inside surface where the food goes is always glazed because you want a glassy surface there, right? And then I just hold this upside down until I stop getting drips. Then I'll do a little touch to see if it's dried, right? It's a little bit drier on the bottom. Pull these off, and I'll have these like nice sort of fingerprints where my hands were. And I'll set this off to the side for now. Being very careful not to touch the surface again, because the top of the pot is usually much wetter than the bottom of the pot, just because it went in first, right? Another good thing about having a giant thing of water is I can clean off my whole hand real quick, right? So that's one way to do it. Same concept, right? We'll do it with, maybe let's do this little mug, or this little bowl. I'm gonna clean this off. That's a little too wet. Get all the dust out of there. And on this one, we're just gonna do sort of the classic tongs, right? So you gotta be careful with these, because if you squeeze this too hard, your pot like will sort of crumble under the pressure. I don't have a ton of pressure on here. If it's a big heavy thing, a lot of times I don't use tongs because I have to hold on for dear life like I'm fishing, right? If it's something light like this, you can get away with it. So what I usually do is I'll go in with it facing down, and we're just going in, and we're pulling out. You don't need to hold pots in here for like 4 or 5 seconds, right? And I'm just gonna give it sort of a little shake. Try to get all those remnants off, because I don't want, on the inside surface at least, I don't want like a drip, because it's gonna be, the glaze is gonna be a little bit thicker there. So I'm trying to avoid that like this. Cool thing about tongs, you can flip them upside down. I don't know if you guys saw, it was like sort of tricky for me to grab the part of the cup that I wanted to hold it by. I don't have to worry about that here. I just set it down like this, and then I gently lift off, and then lift up.
What about the Tom dots?
We'll go over that, yeah. So I'm gonna let both of these dry a little bit, and then Claire's got a good point. When you use tongs, you've got these little tong dots. Depending on the glaze, those will show up, right? So what I like to do after things have dried a little bit is I'll go in and I'll finger sand where those dots are to try to make it sort of a smooth surface. On some glazes, like if they don't have any movement, right, they don't have any flow once they're in the kiln, those dots, if there's like little holes there where there's no glaze, those will come out and there'll be no glaze there. Some of them will flow and fill in, but like just to be safe, I always finger smooth everything. So that's kind of the gist of like the most simple version of glazing, right? Lum, will you grab me a little cup or something I can pour the inside with? Now I'm going to show you what I do on my work, right? Just because, like, I don't know if you guys can tell here. So this is a piece that I sprayed slip on, and I have like a really interesting sort of concrete surface here, which I'd like to keep because I think it's more tactile. So I'm not going to cover that in glaze. I just want to see what it looks like, just the inside glaze and the outside left sort of there like that.
So that outside is not glazed?
Nope. This is just black because it's there's slip on.
I'm not familiar.
That's it's surface class thing. Like I wouldn't worry too much about it. I'm just wanting to show you like what I would do if I don't want the outside of my piece to be glazed,
Okay.
right?
Is that a black slip?
Yeah, this is a black slip.
Where are you getting the slip from?
I need this.
Okay.
I have some slips in here. If you're comfortable and you understand, because we haven't gone over it, you can use them. If you're not comfortable and you don't quite understand, do not use them. Like that's something you usually learn in a surface class, which is like something we can go over one-on-one if you really want to learn it. But just because this is sort of a beginner class, we're going to avoid that for now, right? And so what I'll do if I just want the inside of something glazed, so good thing about the picture, right, is I will do like a little bit of a mix. Just I think for peace of mind, I don't really think we need to do this. We were talking about how often do you mix earlier, right? And so I'm just going to pour this in, fill it most of the way up, set this down, and then move quickly. I'm going to spin this as I'm pouring it out. That's like easier looking than it is, right? So a lot of times you'll have like one little streak that you didn't quite hit. All I do there is just really quickly pour some more in, try to get that little like section filled up with glaze, and then I move on. So like I'm just going to do that, but you can see like I have all these little remnants of where glaze built up. So I'll just come, and then moving down so that I don't go all the way into my pot here, I'll wipe off some of that glaze. Cleaning my sponge out every once in a while, just because I want sort of a crisp line right where that lip is, where there's glaze on the inside, not on the outside. Does that make sense?
Would you ever get a paint, like those marks where you say a quick re-dip might
Yeah.
be in order? Would you ever just dip a paintbrush in the glaze?
You can
bucket?
try, right? So our glazes aren't formulated for painting. You can paint with them if you get like a bunch of it on there, right? Trying to get an evenness that you get from pouring in just that one spot, I think is going to be difficult. So potentially you could. I probably wouldn't, because I don't think it would be best practices to ensure a smooth, even finish on the inside. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Sometimes with certain glazes, you can really tell when a glaze is thin, like the Chun Celadon's like that, right? When it's thin, it kind of looks terrible. And when it's thick, it looks beautiful. So if you have a spot, say there was something like a plate that I dipped in halfway and then dipped in, flipped it over, dipped it in the other half, that part where they overlap is going to be really great looking, and the other two parts are going to look like trash. You know what I mean? I've done it a bunch of times because I'm lazy and I don't want to like grab stuff to do it. Like just, if you can, try to get as smooth and even of a surface on your pieces when you're glazing as possible. Okay? Does anyone have any questions about that?
You're saying if you did dip half and half, it looks like crap?
Well, some where that overlap is, depending on the glaze. That overlap has thicker glaze because it's gone in twice, right? So it might look really good there, and then the parts that just have one,
Single glaze.
yes, then it might not, there'll be variation there, right? So on plates and stuff, I don't like to do the half and half dip. I think it looks worse than if you just got a big bowl, transferred your glaze into a big bowl, and then dipped the whole piece at once. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, what was your question, James?
The rim there that isn't glazed, don't you have to glaze that as well to
Nope.
make it food safe?
You don't have to.
Okay.
Where the point of food safety, right, is like whatever thing is going to sit in your vessel, right? You're worried about your glaze seeping chemicals into that. Say this was for coffee, right? The likelihood that I fill it all the way up to the very, very rim, pretty unlikely, right? So as long as I have a stable glaze on the inside, I don't have to worry about that much. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And unless it's noted, all the glazes here.
For the most part, they are food safe. Silky black is not food safe. It's made with manganese, which is a super poisonous chemical. Like it's bad to even touch in raw form, right? So just be careful, be very mindful of that. I wouldn't use SCM on its own. It doesn't say not food safe, but a lot of times the surface is so gross that I wouldn't want to eat out of it. Those might be the only ones for our cone 6. We've got a bunch of cone 10 glazes that aren't food safe. But for this, because like most of our beginner classes use these, we try to keep them for the most part pretty safe. That said, Silky Black is like one of the most beautiful glazes we have because it's got so much heavy metal in it, you know what I mean, that it creates like beautiful variated surfaces, which you can use, but only on the outside of your pot.
That one's marked, I think.
That one is marked, yeah, and it's marked up here, and yeah, and very few people use it, but just something to be mindful of. If it's a like non-functional piece, if you're making a sculptural piece for something that's gonna like, I don't know, hold like peppermints or something that are wrapped, like all day, you can do whatever, right? Something you're gonna eat or drink out of like a bowl or a cup, I would avoid that.
It'll be okay on the outside.
On the outside would be totally fine.
Yeah.
And the raw edge at the top, where there's no glaze, it's
Uh-huh.
not like, there's not a danger of it like absorbing?
Potentially, right? But like depending on your
Bacteria.
clay, right? It's supposed to be vitrified, which means the absorption rate for liquid is supposed to be really, really, really small by the time it comes out of our glaze firing, to the point where you shouldn't have to worry about it. All right. So reason I showed you that is because for a lot of people, what they like to do is have a different liner glaze than they do for the outside, right? Say that silky black example. I really want to use that on the outside. I think it's a beautiful glaze, but I can't use it on the inside, so what am I going to do there? Sort of same concept we did there, where I'm going to go in with this white, and I'm going to give it just a little bit of an easy mix here.
So you do the inside first.
Always do the inside first. Yep, that's super important. I'm going to swirl this around a little bit, and then while it's pouring out, I'm going to spin it. And especially the case on the inside, right? We don't want to leave the glaze in there forever. You don't want to like set it down, and then, or pour it, set it down, and then walk away and do other stuff. You guys saw how quick that was. If you dip these glazes and they're in there for like 3-4 seconds, you're going to have so much glaze on there that the likelihood that they run right off your pot is pretty high. You really need like a 1.5 second dip, and that's it.
So the ones that you get the notes in the it didn't work shelf, and it says 2 minutes.
Yeah, so a lot of times you'll get like, if you dip your pot, right, and you look inside and there's a bunch of, or rather, if you pour your pot and there's a bunch of cracks in the thing, you have too much glaze in there, you didn't do this process quick enough, right? Or the glaze might be too thick, in which case, like, go talk to whoever's on shift and they can test it and thin it out for you, right? That's not as important on the inside, but if you have a piece that's got too much glaze on the outside, absolutely in the firing, those places where it's cracked will jump off the pot and onto other people's pots or onto our shelves, and I don't want y'all paying for shelves, and I don't want y'all ruining other people's work, right? So another thing to be mindful of, if you're gonna do any glaze layering, right, say like this. This has 3 glazes on it. Each layer is less than if I was just doing one glaze. Does that make sense?
Yeah, just in and out.
Just real quick, because I want to build up layers to be the same thickness as I would just like dip this, 1, 2, pull it out, right? So if I'm doing something where I'm layering, I have 3 thinner coats. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So since we talked about silky black so much, let's go ahead and use some. I might actually do a little bit more layering on this one. What would silky black look good over?
Maybe it's where the lid is.
No, I'm just trying to think of what I want to
Oh,
use
sorry.
for the
That's what I'm
bottom.
looking for. It's right there.
Let's do a really stable glaze, right? So we're gonna do Chun Celadon. Here it is. So a lot of times what I do, if I'm gonna do any layering, which I'm gonna show you guys right now, I like to have a really stable glaze on the bottom half, and then I'll put a really runny glaze on the top. That way the stable glaze will catch any of those runs, right?
How do you know that's stable glaze?
You can ask me, I can tell you which ones are stable. Yeah, I've practiced with these a lot more than you, right? So like the clear is a really stable glaze, the Chun Celadon's a really stable glaze. I know which ones are running and which ones aren't, so just let me know. So there's a couple ways that people layer. Like a lot of Gabe's pots are single dipped in like a glaze where like the inside color is the same as the outside color, and then he builds up layers on top of there. What I like to do is like have sort of 3 different glazes going on because I get a lot of different layering, but I don't put them all over one glaze to begin with. So I'll leave this raw for now, glaze the inside, then we'll mix up this stable glaze. Sponge, clean off my sticks, so I'm not using 40 sticks, even though I'm one person. Which happens a lot, and then the like number of glazes that get left just like open because people are doing something and then they forget is really high, so I want to just try to limit that as much as I can.
And are y'all like prepping all of these glazes like with studio assistants and you guys like just throughout the week? Like how does that,
Yeah.
what's that
So
process?
like usually, a lot of times when you come in, like especially me because I'm here all the time, right? I'll come in and take a peek at which ones are low, and then we'll make a note. Downside being because we want to test everything before we put it out to you guys so that we don't mess something up and then it ruins a bunch of your work. If something's low and we make a new batch of it, it usually takes 2 or 3 days for me to test it, make sure it's good, and then combine them. But we've had much better results since we've been testing every glaze before it goes out on the floor than when we just like trust our math, you know what I mean? There's also like 30 people that work here, so like the likelihood that every one of those 30 people is like a glaze chemist is pretty low, right? So we just want to be be mindful of that. So now that this has been mixed up, I'm going to take this. A lot of times I flip it upside down, so if it does run, it runs down the stick and not off onto the floor. What I like to do when I layer is I start with the bottom, right? So I'm going to dip this probably 3/4 of the way up, and then shake.
What color is that?
This is Chuncellanon. So this one honestly doesn't look that beautiful on brown clay, but it's really stable, so I'm going to use it. Just like that, right? And then I will set this off to the side until that's dry enough. I will flip it over, and then I will do the top half overlapping to here. That way I'll sort of have a bunch of different combinations going on, right? So where the Monterey white meets my top glaze, it's going to have a chemical reaction. It's going to have just the, say I'm doing silky black, right? This will just be silky black. Then right here where they overlap will be the chemical reaction of silky black with Chuncellanon. And then the bottom will just, it's like having 5 glazes on the pot if you do it this way. And I really enjoy it.
So I noticed, trim apart, are 2 little drips from the interior? Did you wipe them off?
I didn't. No, if I'm doing this much layering, there's going to be a lot of surface movement, so I don't worry about it.
Okay.
If you really want like so say I was doing the same thing, but I wasn't doing a double layer here, right? If I was just going like white on the inside, black on the outside, I might clean those up a little bit just to make sure that I have a crisper line there. It's really aesthetics though. Whatever you want is what you should do. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Right around now, this is probably, I usually am like very careful when I touch just to make sure. Sometimes if this is really wet, you'll do this, you'll have a perfect fingerprint gone, you have to patch in, right? Also, if I get any little bubbles that accumulate on the surface here, I'll go in and I'll finger sand those away. I think this is just a peace of mind thing. You might be able to get away with not doing that, but I like to do that.
So you don't have to do the carpeting off the foot at this point?
No, I usually wait till a piece is done. I might do it now actually, just because it's already dry, so it'll be easy to deal with. Let me find that black glaze though.
Right underneath, yeah.
Aha. Set this off to the side for now.
I use that just on a thing, and it's really beautiful.
It's insanely gorgeous. You get really beautiful bronzes where it's thick. It like gets really metallic and shiny, which
It's
I
almost
really love.
raccoon looking.
Yeah, very much so. That's because it's got so much poison in it. You want to make stuff that looks really cool? Like lead glazes were amazing when we could use them, but that hasn't been for like 20 years. You know what I mean?
I can do it that way.
One of my favorite glaze books is just like full. It's from the 70s, and it's every glaze in it is just like add this much lead. And yeah, you can make some really cool looking stuff. Not great for eating.
Don't let the baby eat them.
Yeah. Turns out that lead stuff not good for you. Yeah. I'm gonna get this.
Are most of the glazes glossy?
Most of them are glossy. They'll usually say if they're not. So like, this one just says mustard, right? But like on the thing it says Brit's pretty matte mustard. It's pretty matte, or like I would say it's more of a satin finish. You know what I mean? That one's a satin finish. The Monterey white matte is kind of a satiny finish too. It really depends on the cooling in the kiln. If things cool really slowly, they form more crystals, and that gives you a more matte surface. If they cool really quickly, you get a glossier surface a lot of the time.
These are the glazes that are 26.
These are all the Cone 6 glazes, yep. For the most part, there's like the weird Reptar green in there, which is, I made a test style of it somewhere. It's weird and ugly. Here it is. So this Reptar green is what happens when you mix up 2 chemicals when you're mixing glazes. So this is the reason that we test everything before we put it out. This is the same materials as is in the pink, except when you mix up the chrome and the tin, it turns green instead of pink. Yeah, because everything is not like, it kind of doesn't work like normal color theory does, you know what I mean? Everything's just a combination of different chemistry to yield the result that we're looking for, right?
Is this like one application and then 2?
Nope. So I don't know if you can see from the back side, right? There's a white slip on the right side. What that means is this is what it'll look like on white clay. This is what it'll look like on brown clay.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Yeah. All right, so I'm going to take this, flip it upside down so it's not dripping on the floor. Put that in there. And I will, because this bottom glaze dried off pretty quickly. I'll show you how this thing works. I've just saturated this with water in the sink and then scraped most of that water off. And it's really great because you can just drag your pot along and end up with like a pretty clean surface on the bottom. If you have a deep footwell, you can keep glaze in there. This footwell's not very deep. So what I'm going to do is really make sure that's cleaned off. And then I will take, what am I
It's right there, it's on the corner.
Aha! I will take my smaller clean bucket, right? And I'll just get rid of some of that like
Are you
little
not
stuff.
worried about the glaze like kind of dripping?
Off the sides here?
Yeah.
No, that's why I use such a stable glaze on the outside, because I know that this will catch everything.
Okay.
And so, like when I was in college, they were very like, oh, all your pots got to be wiped up a 1/4 inch minimum, right? And everything's got to be waxed and all that jazz. This thing gives you what I would consider the sort of perfect amount of glaze space from the side of the pot to the bottom of the pot, right?
You push down pretty hard.
I do, right? And so basically however thick the carpet part is on here, that's how high up that line's gonna sit. And it's just a much crisper line than if I try to achieve this with wax. You know what I mean? And so I like doing this much, much better. I feel like,
Just to be clear, anything that's drippy, like that we need to use the cookie with, anything that's drippy is marked.
for the most part, yeah. I mean, it depends. Some of them, if they're thick, right? So like
They're the
spearmint.
drippier.
Spearmint, if you do it right, not drippy. If you leave a pot in there for like 4 seconds, hell yeah, it's drippy. You know what I mean? So just things to be mindful of. We can go over each one by one right after this if you want to, so that you can make a little note of like drippy, not food safe, all that jazz. But this is how far I want this to come down, right? This has been mixed up, so now I'm gonna grab it by that bottom part, dip it in, and I'm gonna overlap by maybe about 1 inch. And then I'm gonna do this
Nice.
until most of that comes off, right? This is another thing when I was talking to you guys about how to trim the bottom of your feet too. If you have a bowl that you're trying to do this same process with and you don't have somewhere to grab because your foot is trimmed weird, it makes everything much, much, much more difficult. So like if I had, so this is done, right? So I can just set this off to the side until that rim dries, and then once that rim dries, I'll put it back on the glaze cup, right?
I wish I could see it today.
But are you gonna wipe the
Interior of the rim.
No.
oh, okay.
Nope. But like if you guys see here, right, if I was doing that same thing, I trimmed my foot in such a way that I could dip this and get, like it would make it easier, right? This was just round on the bottom. I'd have to kind of like hold it like this, and it's a total pain in the butt to do this same process, right? Which is why I tell you guys to trim so that you can hold something upside down pretty easily,
If
right?
you are using the poison glaze,
Uh-huh,
and that's gonna be something that you're gonna drink out of,
uh-huh.
then would you not use it on top, or once it's?
I would only use it on the top because it's runny. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
The minuscule interaction that the glaze has right here to right here,
Is, oh,
I'm
you
not
said
super
only
worried
when
about.
someone's gonna sit in it.
Yeah,
Okay,
right? So
got
like
it.
your liner glaze has
Sorry.
got to be stable.
Yeah,
This little interaction here, I'm not super concerned about. Also, most of the time, what you're drinking is like probably worse for you than what your cup's gonna do to that, right? Like that was full, yeah. Maybe if it was full of just like green juice, then we'd be set. But yeah, a lot of the yeah. Anyways, I'll leave that one. So that's basically the gist of it, right? Because this has a runny glaze on top, and it still might like overpass the stable glaze on the bottom. We have these things in the back called cookies. If you go into the kiln room, right, there's like a little set of 4 things that have like shelves and posts and stuff like that. On the back one, so if I was in the kiln room, I would be facing this way, I think? No, this way. There's a little bin that says cookies. They're basically just like little waste discs. And that way, if that does run off the pot, it runs off onto a cookie and not off onto the shelf. Again, so you're not buying us shelves, and cookies are really easy to break off with a hammer. You know what I mean? So if you're ever unsure, most of these glazes are pretty safe, but like a lot of beginner students just put every single one of their pieces on a cookie just to be safe, because it's like not worth the hassle, right? Until you sort of learn what our glazes do, a lot of this is just experience. You know what I mean? Does anybody have any questions? Doing good, doing good. That's pretty much the gist of that, y'all. So all I'm going to do for the rest of these, right, like this one, is I'm going to do that same thing. I run it along the bottom here and clean it off, and you can see
Yeah, that's great.
when I trimmed it, I made sure that I had like a decent amount of space between the very bottom and here. That's because I wanted the inside to be filled with glaze. So if this point here is too close to the surface, that will fuse to the kiln shelf. So just be mindful of that. Just to be safe, what I recommend a lot of people do is just clean off all this glaze until you get sort of comfortable. But if you trimmed your pot well, you should be able to have the inside of the footwell glazed as well. And then I'm going to go over this real quick too. You see these like little tongue marks, right? Same thing I did with those bubbles is I'm just going to finger smooth those so they're slightly less visible. after the glaze firing. This one's all done, it's got all the glaze cleaned out there. I'm gonna check my side. I've also like done another touch up after the carpet, right? What a lot of people will do is like if they wax their pot, they'll dip it, see that it's mostly clean and think that's good. If there's any glaze here, I'm gonna kick your pot off of the glaze shelf and it's gonna go on the learning shelf, right? Because I don't want you to lose it. I'd rather you like learn the lesson of like there's any glaze here, it can't go on there, than learn it by losing your pot. Does that make sense? So that's what that shelf is for. So like, hey, next time maybe don't do this, but I don't want you to waste a piece, you know what I mean? So this one's all set, I'll set that off to the side. And I'm just gonna keep doing this, same thing here, right? I'm just gonna use the carpet, because the carpet makes everything easy.